Good morning. I'm Julio Saenz, along with Mauricio Riveros. Today, we'll meet Margit Brazda Poirier, owner of Grants for Good, where she helps nonprofits accomplish their mission.
We hope you will be inspired.
Celebrating leaders in Rochester's unique and vibrant business community. We'll meet entrepreneurs whose passion and perseverance have helped push through life's challenges. Join us as we share their stories and journeys to success. It's time to be inspired.
Margaret, thank you so much to Be Inspired, a show that we developed to interview people like you, interesting innovators, people who can inspire us today. And I'm sure that you will inspire us today. So tell us a little bit about you and your story here in Rochester.
Sure, great. Thanks a lot for inviting me here. As I was saying earlier, I've seen many of my colleagues on your show. It's a fantastic and inspiring show. So thank you for doing this. My name is Margit, and I moved to Rochester when I was really young. I'm actually an immigrant. I came from Vienna, Austria, and I am the daughter of an entrepreneur. My father started a tool and die business here in Rochester in the 1970s, back in the big heyday of manufacturing. And I started my own business, Grants for Good, in 2009. I'm a business owner, and I started it right at the tail end of the Great Recession that we had. And now here we are during COVID, facing more troubled economic times, and all the more reason to have this type of business.
So that's powerful. So tell us a little bit about your business. What's the vision that you have, the mission that you want to accomplish during, all this time that people need people who has that expertise to provide the service that you do?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. When I started Grants for Good, it was in 2009. Organizations were struggling, and I found that there were so many nonprofits that had really incredible ideas of big changes, things they can do in the community that help people, the environment, animals, you name it. Great ideas, but oftentimes they would look for grant funding and they'd write a written grant application that just wasn't very clear. And so I started the company right after I had served for several years as a foundation director, giving out grants, okay? And I had done plenty of grant writing before that too, so I knew the struggles on both sides of how hard it is to make decisions and how hard it is to write these grant applications. So I really started the business by accident, which I think is how a lot of businesses start. There was an idea. There was one customer that said, Margit, we would like your help, please, getting a grant application ready for a nonprofit. There's a lot of funding in it for us, and we really need this to keep up our mission. So it started by accident, and it has just mushroomed since then. Really the mission of Grants for Good, if I want to just boil it down, is it's to empower nonprofits to get the funding they need to do incredible things in the community. Now, I say nonprofits, I do work with businesses too, but nonprofits are the majority of our clients because most of the grants out there are for the nonprofit organizations that have that IRS 501c3 designation.
Okay. Yeah, and there are some grants out there for businesses that you help folks.
There are.
Great.
Yeah. Yep.
And
especially when it comes to economic development, there are lots of grants out there. And James Sinal, one of your former guests, I think, spoke a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, we've had a few guests talk about those grants that have helped them get over the hump when they're starting their business and everything. So, and so I also want to talk to you a little bit about, the world of nonprofits. I think that sometimes people don't understand that it's just like any other business, right? You got to find money, and you got to find a way to pay people and everything else to have your mission become a reality. Now, I sometimes get asked by people who have that entrepreneurial spark, I want to start a nonprofit. Maybe there's a cause that inspires them. What kind of checklist or advice would you give somebody that wants to start a nonprofit for something they want to see done in the community, some good?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've had that question myself in the business. I would say before you start a nonprofit, consider if that's the route you want to go, or if you have an idea for a program that could be done under an existing nonprofit. Because one thing about nonprofits, actually, we could have a whole show just about this, but one thing is that it is like running a business. You have to get revenue because you're going to have expenses. So in other words, you have to pay your staff, you have to pay yourself as director, and you have to be solely responsible for finding the revenue. And that's where a lot of the challenge comes in starting your own nonprofit. So if you do that, you just need to have a revenue plan. Where is the money going to come from? And typically in the nonprofits I work with, they get a balance of funding from fundraising events. I was at one this morning, virtually, of course. So they could be fundraising events. There could be individual donors that feel strongly about the mission of that nonprofit. And there's a section of money that comes from grants. I never recommend relying solely on grant funding for a nonprofit. I've probably had one client where we've gotten almost all of their money from grants, and that was a local group here called Oasis that worked on adaptive sports for veterans that were coming back with physical and traumatic injuries. And most of what they did was all funded by the grants we wrote. But most of my clients really rely on a number of different sources. But what surprises me is people don't think about grant writing or grants as a source of revenue. So it's often overlooked. And that's where I think there's a big gap that can help people starting a nonprofit or people that are on the board of a nonprofit trying to help out, or volunteers, or directors like of any nonprofit.
And that's so important because one of the problems that I saw is people saying, well, grants are difficult. It's a process. You need to do applications and a lot of paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where you play a very important role. So maybe you can describe what type of services you provide to those organizations to expedite, to help them, to guide them, and to really do good applications. In that way, they have a better opportunities to be able to be successful when they apply that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Really, when I started Grants for Good, it was just me, and it was strictly to work with nonprofit organizations one-on-one to help them, first of all, find the best grant opportunities, and then secondly, write winning grant applications, because they're very, very competitive. Even if you write a wonderful grant application, there's no guarantee it's going to get funding. So I started originally for that purpose. Then over the years, I've added a couple people to my practice. There's 4 associates now that work with me, and I love having a team. This is what makes it really fun. I love having a team to work with, along with my wonderful clients. And I found that in the last about 5 to 6 years, I've put a lot of my focus and my personal energy on empowering other nonprofits to do this for themselves. Because when my first grant, I wrote it in 1993, back when I was working for the Monroe County Health Department here in Rochester. And I wrote it to a foundation. I'll tell you, it was the Ben & Jerry's Foundation. And I thought I should get the grant because I eat their ice cream, right? But I wrote a great grant application. I did not get the money. And then I just learned, and I learned all by myself. There were no webinars at the time in 1993. There was nowhere else to learn. So what I've done is I've taken 20 some years of my experience with nonprofit management and grant writing and boiled it into one online course, which is called All About Grant Writing. It's on allaboutgrantwriting.com if you want to hear more about that. But most importantly, I also offer a lot of free resources that are just going to help nonprofits get started in understanding what's involved, clearing some of the common misconceptions that people might have about grant funding. And I do that through webinars. I have a free webinar coming up on Thursday, May 6th, and it is called How Nonprofits Can Thrive in a Pandemic and Beyond. And the reason I want to teach this now is that, I read up a lot about nonprofits, and there's some pretty disturbing statistics. And one of them is that just last year alone, 3 out of 5 nonprofits had to cut costs. They had to lay off staff. And about half of nonprofits right now are saying they're cutting staff and laying off people this year. And the final statistic is anywhere between 11% and 38% of nonprofits are expected to go out of business by the end of 2022 as a direct result of the pandemic. So when I hear that, I think to myself that is completely unacceptable. Because think about, the nonprofits and how organizations help people with mental health issues, with homelessness, with domestic violence. Think about arts and culture organizations like museums, music, stages, theater. You know, we take nonprofits for granted, but really they just fuel what we need and what we want. A lot of times they make Rochester great. You know, they make our city and every community really worth living in. So when I heard that statistic, I thought, you know, we cannot lose hundreds of thousands of nonprofits in the US. And I made it a mission to get these webinars out there and at least in 1 hour, share as much as I can and get people started in what they need to know about getting some revenue from grants, you know, staying alive, keeping the doors open, doing great things.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be back with more after these messages.
When you start discovering that type of thing and you start thinking, wow, there is a possibility. And if you have a not-for-profit organization, you should contact Margit and really be able to develop those and investigate those opportunities that exist out there. So tell us a little bit, one story, and this is a tough one. I'm going to give you one story that will be really inspirational for our people, that you have wrote a grant and was this scary thing and then you got it and was just transformational. I'm sure you have one of those.
Oh my gosh, I have many of those. I have so many stories. You know, when I started Grants for Good, I didn't know that I would be doing this 12 years later. And the reason I'm just here is because the clients I work with, I just love them. I get to know them. I start to really get invested in their mission. I'll tell you the most recent story. This morning, I was involved in a fundraising event. It was virtual, of course, and it was for Resolve of Greater Rochester, which helps women, actually people, but mostly women that have been directly affected by domestic violence so that they can thrive and not return to their abuser and lead healthy lifestyles. Such an important mission. Well, guess what? Because of the pandemic and all of the self-isolation, the rates of domestic violence increased more than 30% in New York State. They went up drastically. My client Resolve, and I know they won't mind me telling you this, my client Resolve saw a 40% increase in demand for services. So now I'm talking with the executive director and we're saying, what do we do? You've got people that are just desperate, in desperate situations, or not so desperate, but they really need the help and they need it from Resolve. So we got very busy with grant writing. And in the last 12 months, we raised 5 times as much in grant funding than we did the prior 12 months, all because the demand was there. 40% increase in services, and we increased the grant funding drastically. They got to hire more therapists, help more people who needed it right when they needed it most. So I love that story because that's a lot of why I do. But I have so many of those stories. When I tell you about, veterans and adaptive sports, one of the sports they do is skiing at Bristol Mountain. I ski there too. So I go there and I'll sometimes ski with them. And I remember one time finishing up and thinking to myself, this is why I do what I do. It's not because I love sitting in front of a computer writing. It's because I love what my clients are doing for and with other people. It's like we're just this little spoke in the wheel, aren't we? You know, with all of this, and it adds up. It makes a big difference.
Absolutely, those are powerful stories.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing those.
Sure.
Going back to 2009, you mentioned a little bit about, starting the business. What gave you the gumption that you could start your own business?
Great question, because that was not something I was planning to do. Never say never. So for any of your viewers and listeners out there, it is completely possible. I'll tell you what led to this. It was a beautiful accident, really, a kind of a perfect storm of having finally the skills to do this kind of work, the grant writing, working with nonprofits, and loving to work independently. I really am good at being organized and being my own boss, and I love working with clients. So I don't think I would have started the business if I put a lot of pressure on myself and said, I have to have this many clients or I have to earn this much money. I didn't come in it with any of that. I was a little more naive. I really was just starting off to help one or two nonprofits with their work, and I billed them something per hour, and I set up a DBA, doing business as, and I called it Grants for Good. And a couple of years later, I formed it into an LLC and hired people, and it grew gradually. But I think it would have been intimidating if you asked me in 2009 if you told me what I was going to be doing today, and yet it just naturally evolves.
So COVID-19, we don't know, we think that probably we are in better position than where we were, but no one knows, right? No one has a magic ball there. How not-for-profit organizations, what do you see the future of our not-for-profits in Rochester? You know very well them. One of the challenges that I see is a lot of overlaps. There will be some cases of affiliations. That's how the not-for-profits called mergers, but we will call affiliations. What's the future? Because I have been, thinking this is one of the most giving communities. But so what do you think is the future? What's your guessing around that?
Well, I don't know who said the future is now, but I can tell you what's happening now, because I think it is outlining what is going to be happening in the next year or two or further even. And, as you said, mergers. I have one client that already merged with another large nonprofit, and their program is still staying intact. It's just under the umbrella of a different nonprofit. And I have another client that is in the process of this merger. And interestingly enough, they received a grant to make the merger happen because, there are legal fees involved, right? When you blend two organizations, there is staff time, there are numerous meetings involved, paperwork. So they did receive a grant. It was from United Way of Greater Rochester, Synergy Grants, and they are really there to help merge some of these nonprofits. Now, one of the advantages of that is that you can start to share some of the resources. So costs go down a little bit, right? A little, they go down. And you can start to work together on obtaining the revenue, the fundraisers, the grant writing, whatever fees for services you might have. So I think that is going to be a trend. I think another trend is going to be shifting to, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but shifting business and nonprofits are businesses in a way that cuts cost. So today's fundraising event saved money because there wasn't a big conference room for 500 people reserved. So, that's one example. Fundraising events might start to cost a little less. There might be cost savings in virtually how business is done. The group I mentioned, Resolve, that does a very unique model of trauma-informed therapy for domestic violence survivors, have been doing some of that therapy online as well as some in person for safety reasons. So I feel like technology is going to change a lot. I think about, I work with Big Brothers Big Sisters. They run their mentoring programs are fantastic. Maybe you've been a big brother to somebody. Some of those meetings had to happen virtually. So yeah, there's going to be some shifts along those lines. I do think, though, if there's one takeaway for nonprofits, is that you can stay in business, but you have to think about, again, where the revenue comes from and how your expenses are going to change in the next year or two. And, I'm glad, grants aren't really the most exciting thing. Somebody told me once, I don't know why they think that, but I think they're exciting, but they're important. And guess what? You can do it. If there's three things I want to leave people with, it's one that there is money out there. There's money out there for nonprofits and for businesses, and foundations, state, government, they have to give it out. Secondly, you can do this. You can learn how to do this. That's where I'm here. I've got tons of help I can offer you. And lastly, I recommend not waiting. And the reason I think it's important to get started now and plan ahead for where your revenue is going to come from, is grant funding alone can take 3 to 6 months till you get a check in the mail. Let's say, Maurizio, you and I sit down, we write a fantastic grant application. We've spent tons of time planning this program. It's the best ever. And we submit it, and it takes 6 months to hear back.
I love that it's not a job, it's really a mission.
It is.
What you are doing is impacting so many places, so many organizations, and it's beautiful. I love Rochester. Rochester is a place that we have been very blessed with many things, and having organizations like you who are helping to bring grants internationally or nationally, those grants that can help and bring resources, jobs to our community is fundamental. For that reason, thank you very much. We really appreciate, and I'm sure that we will have you in the future in our shows to see the progress that you are making in your great organization. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Oh, and let me just I'll give you my website if anyone does want to attend the free webinar on May 6th. My website is grantsforgood.com. So it's GRANTS, the number 4 good.com. And there's some other freebies on there as well that you can download and just get started.
Coming up next week, we'll meet Brett Garwood, CEO of Home Leasing.
To watch today's episode and the complete interviews of our guests, go to rochesterfirst.com/be-inspired. For more great talk with Rochester's entrepreneurs, listen to Bodette 97.1 Saturdays at 9 a.m. For Mauricio Riveros, I'm Julio Saenz. We'll see you next week on Be Inspired.